think it makes sense to look at the Chinese sixth generation fighter jets, the J-36 and J-50. And probably the first question is also, how much do we know about them? Unlike with the F-47, we've actually have some footage of them, of test flights of both of those planes in real life. But why is China developing two different sixth generation fighter jets instead of one? Because I assume that makes it probably a lot more expensive, and it's harder to build two types than just one. And so why is it approaching it differently than the US? And how are the two models different from each other? And what are their roles supposed to be?
So there's a lot we don't know up front. The Shenyang or J50 as people are calling it, the Shenyang product is clearly significantly smaller than the Chengdu one. It's still also pretty radical in terms of it's a fairly novel design solution. It also seems to have a cockpit. It's a sort of cranked diamond fuselage shape with twin intakes and twin engines. It's a bit more traditionally fighter sized. Significantly more traditionally fighter sized than the triple engine Chengdu sort of double Dorito, which is very radical in terms of the both the split intakes below and the dorsal DSI above. The triple engine layout is very unusual. They're both tailless aircraft. They're both clearly designed for a different level of broadband stealthiness compared to J20 or J35. I don't know yet that they are definitely developing both. It is worth remembering that until the recent award to Boeing, there were two American primes competing for what became F-47. So while we know there was at least one flying demonstrator that was flying for many years, there may have been two. And so it would be worth reading across that you could interpret this as both Shenyang and Chengdu have been told to fly their demonstrators in public during the daylight over major cities, and therefore to show them to the public as a signal to domestic audiences, to regional rivals, and to the US.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. There's a lot of news on geopolitics, but most of it just doesn't actually matter. It's just chasing headlines, emotions, and breaking news. What I want to do is to try to separate all this noise and find the signal, the stuff that actually does matter and will have consequences months and years down the line.
Or it could be that they're both being actively developed. It should be said, China has a history of parallel development programs in the military aerospace sector. So, for example, for quite a while, they were developing their J-11B line. So the indigenously produced derivative of the J-11A, which was a licensed manufactured Su-27, so Russian Sukhoi 27. So they were developing the J-11B with the J-11D, which was a version with an AESA radar and a bunch of other improvements, alongside the J-16, which was a sort of indigenously developed variant of the Su-30, which has ultimately apparently seems to have been the one that's been kind of concentrated on as the main route forward, with an AESA radar and lots of other capabilities that traditional Su-30s tend to lack. Russian-built ones, anyway. And those went in parallel. You now have the J-35 seemingly being continually developed into something approaching a sort of active operational combat aircraft. For a long time, that was sort of in the background as a quasi demonstrator that didn't seem to have got orders for a while, but clearly it was worked on in the background. The professional China air power watchers are probably tearing their hair out at my characterization of this, because this is I'm used to looking at the airplanes, but I don't speak Mandarin, and so my ability to track chat is not nearly the same as Joe or Andres Ruprecht or some of the other guys who like really focus on this stuff. Bit of a disclaimer there. But equally, if you look at AWACS, for example, China has had multiple and continues to have multiple development and production programs. So you have the traditional, more traditional KJ2000, which is essentially a derivative of the Ilyushin 76 based A50 with initially Israeli co-development, which was then broken off, sort of. There's still some controversy there, but that is something that looks a bit like a traditional four engine jet overwinged AWACS. But they also were simultaneously working on the KJ200, the KJ500, which are turboprop derivatives. They produced a lot of KJ500s. There's also the KJ3000s, KJ6000. So China has this history of working on lots of things in parallel. And, I suspect part of this comes down to the fact that this is still, while it is not a traditional communist country anymore, in terms of their economy, this is fundamentally still a communist state. And so for them, employment is a benefit regardless necessarily of what it costs. Everybody needs to be employed. The state needs to be producing stuff, is a part of that ideological baseline. And so to a degree, having multiple factories doing relatively parallel things, especially if it gives options and keeps windows open for development in the military space and the technology space, is seen much less, I suspect, in terms of just upfront cost and more in terms of the benefits in terms of industrial base, employment, etc., development of specialists, development of capability, than it would be in a Western country where we, for good reasons, have very, very hefty oversight of defense spending and how industry spends that, partly because of some extremely bad behavior by defense industry over many, many decades. Maybe that as well. But in terms of where they sit, I would suggest the J-36, the Chengdu aircraft, is in a slightly different class in that it is just so much bigger, so much heavier, and therefore is likely to have been optimized much more heavily around significant range with significant payload capacity at high altitudes and speeds relative to the Shenyang product, which looks like a novel and interesting approach to how would you design a stealthier fighter type platform, but with a slightly more conventional set of range and performance requirements, albeit clearly more emphasis on broadband stealth. And